We used to talk about our consultants at the table group. You know, we have 50 consultants around the world that do our stuff with us. And we used to say, if you're going to be a good consultant, you have to be a little bit dorky. You have to be like so geeked out about organizational health and about helping your clients that you really don't care if they perceive you as cool. Welcome to At the Table, the podcast that lives at the intersection between leadership and teamwork and organizational health and culture. I'm Pat Lencioni, your host, joined by my co-host, Cody Thompson. How you doing today, Cody?
Still here, Pat. Doing great.
That's all I can ask. What's the topic today, Cody?
Leadership isn't cool.
Yeah, I really love this topic. It came from something I saw recently. There was a recent study done by 3 professors, and I'm amazed that people get to study these things, but they decided to look at the definition of what made a person cool. Again, I don't know who greenlights these studies, but they did it across cultures and languages and nations. And so they studied what is it that makes somebody be perceived as cool. And they came up with 6 attributes, and they're really interesting. And it says a lot about leadership and whether leaders should be cool. And that's what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, Pat, I love, it sounds like a study done by some middle schoolers to figure out what's cool,
Exactly.
But this will be really interesting to dive into, like, hey, in the context of work and business and life, what does the general society think constitutes a leader being cool?
And you know what? I will say this, and I'll make myself look old, and some people that are a little older will like this, but the word cool was no longer cool when I was a kid until Fonzie came along from Happy Days. And he did this thing, he'd go, cool. And it was totally dorky until he did that. And then it brought it back. And as far as I can tell, it's been cool to say cool since then.
Well, to translate to you, Pat, I think it's what makes a leader groovy. Does that work for you better?
Yeah, that's what it was before that.
Okay.
Before that. I'm such a hippie, so it really works out. So here is the list of 6 adjectives that they discovered. Okay, the first one was adventurous. That was one. Okay. The next one was autonomous. I thought, oh, okay. The next one was open. I'm not exactly sure what that means, but that's what they said. And the other one was extroverted, which, you know, you think like, that doesn't seem to fit, right? But this is relatively benign. You know, these are just 4 words. But the next 2 are the ones that caught my attention. And what caught my attention, Cody, was that they didn't present this like it was a problem. Everybody was like, hey, isn't this interesting? And I think it's really problematic because the next 2 attributes of a person who's considered cool, to round out the 6, is powerful and hedonistic. Powerful and hedonistic. And just those 2 together, the combination of those 2 things is really, really dangerous. A person that is both naturally inclined toward power and hedonism. And if people don't know what hedonism is, it's the idea that pleasure is more important than anything, seeking pleasure and avoiding pain. So a powerful person who's seeking their own pleasure should never be a leader. Yeah. And that's what I want to talk about today. It's like, many times people want to be a leader. This could be in any kind of a situation. And they're like, man, I would really like to be kind of cool and considered that kind of person. And we just can't be that way.
Yeah, this will be really fun to explore, Pat, because we talk about, we just had an episode about dissecting the GOAT, like what makes a great leader. And so there's a couple things I'd love to explore the actual answers they came up with. But additionally, I may want to go back to the origin of this study, right? Like the idea that we are suggesting, I've said this to you in the last couple of weeks, like the right answer to the wrong question is still the wrong answer. And so the fact that they set out to say what makes a leader cool rather than effective, like any of those other attributes would have been interesting for them to explore. But the idea that we're going down the road of what makes them cool means that we might be off the reservation to start.
Well, to be fair, the study was just about what makes people cool.
Okay.
But even that is kind of dangerous because I want to be cool. Okay. Be hedonistic and powerful and autonomous and extroverted and whatever. But the last 2, it's like any leader that wants to be cool, and I don't care if you're the pastor of a church, the CEO of a company, the principal of a school, the football coach, if you're a leader and you want people to perceive you as having that kind of cool vibe, you are going to do dangerous things. And I think about Silicon Valley and why in my lifetime, I've always found that there was a real lack of great leaders in the Silicon Valley. And I realize now it's because so many of them were really dorky kids who grew up and wanted to be cool. And so this idea of hedonism and power seemed to predominate. And I realized that is really a bad thing. And when I think about the people I've worked with over the years, Cody, the ones that were trying to be cool were really dangerous to work for because you never knew when something was going to happen and bad things would happen to the people around them.
Yeah, and I think what's so interesting, but what piques my interest when you bring this up is like, you've written books on leadership, a handful of them, and I think we can actually take some of this criteria and kind of retroactively look at attributes or aspects, of people's character that led them, that lend themselves to be in terms of like considered a leader. And I love that you broke it up in the first four. And I don't know how you want to do this. Do you want to tackle the last two that seem so out of place? Or do you think like it's worth even exploring some of the first four and saying, does that actually, because right out of the gate, when you said the word extroverted, I thought, well, half the population, that just eliminates them.
Right.
Like by nature of how they're wired. That's so interesting.
Yeah.
And then to go into some of the adventurous or autonomous things. And we can go back and look at, the 3 or 4 different books that you've written to say, how does this fit in terms of real life, the leaders that we've seen lead healthy organizations?
Yeah. Yeah. And by the way, this was a very thorough study across cultures and languages and countries. I mean, I know China was one of the countries on there, of course, the US and Chile and Brazil, but I mean, multiple countries. And they really did rigorous analysis and said, what were the adjectives people used to describe? And these were the 6 most common. So this is not just a throwaway. It's like, it really makes me think that being a leader and being cool are different. And let's break it down by each of these adjectives and decide, maybe we're not, Cody, I think it's something interesting to talk about here is we used to talk about our consultants at the Table Group. We have 50 consultants around the world that do our stuff with us and they work with clients. And we used to say, if you're going to be a good consultant, you have to be a little bit dorky.
Yeah.
We used to say, you have to be like so geeked out about organizational health and about helping your clients that you really don't care if they perceive you as cool. Mm-hmm. But we never realized that this would actually get documented in a study and why we would understand why a leader shouldn't be as well. So yeah, let's go through these adjectives and talk about what it makes sense.
Well, I like that any of our consultants that are listening to this, you just told them that we hired them because they're dorky. That's going to be really fun for them to find out live.
I think they know. They know. I was the first consultant too, so.
Yeah. Well, so the one that actually struck me as maybe the most viable criteria for a leader was open. And we talk so much about vulnerability. And if what they intend to mean by that is that you're humble and open to being wrong, or you're open to new ideas, you're pretty resilient and adaptable, then I could see that being a pretty decent criteria.
For being cool. That was the word I thought, okay, open. A good leader is probably open. A cool person is probably open. That one that didn't cause me a lot of problem.
Right.
Autonomous is another one. Now, that's not a terrible thing. Now, you can't be like go everything on your own. You have to be group oriented, but I suppose it's good to have some level of autonomy if you want to be a good leader. And I guess you can see a cool person being autonomous in terms of like not really caring what other people think of them too much, I suppose.
Yeah. If they mean it in the sense of like, a lot of leaders have to push against the status quo, or they're more comfortable being sort of unique rather than, like in the flow of how everybody tends to operate. I could see that being a thing. Adventurous, that struck me as really interesting.
Yeah. I mean, a cool person is perceived as adventurous. I guess that kind of goes with open, like wants new experiences. I don't know. The more I read this, I go, I am so not cool. My kids will tell you that too. So that's clear. But so adventurous, maybe there's a certain openness to some risk. Mm-hmm. And maybe that's a good thing in a leader, not to be too concerned about that. So maybe those 3. Now, extroverted, that just doesn't make any sense to me. Neither from leadership nor from being cool. In fact, I'd have thought a cool person is kind of introverted because they're kind of mysterious and they don't talk a lot and they're like, "Ooh, what's going on in there?" And where was it that they said? I don't know where it was where somebody said, "Don't talk a lot because people will attribute you to being more intelligent than you are." And so I kind of think really quiet people get perceived as cool because you don't know that maybe they don't have a lot to say. I don't know.
Yeah. So it really is these last two.
Introverts don't have a lot to say. They do. But I mean, I always thought you'd want to err on the side of introversion to be cool.
Yeah. So it really is I love that you set it up that way because it really got to the last two where it was like they all seem at least in some way arguable or understandable. And then when you got to hedonistic, that part seemed like it was way out of left field.
And when I saw this presented on a TV show first, and then I went and looked it up, everywhere, both on the TV show and in the articles, nobody actually raised any alarm about it. They didn't say hedonism. Wow, well, that's not good. And I guess it's because we live in a time where people think it's okay to pursue pleasure all the time and to avoid pain. But of course, if you're a leader and you're avoiding pain and pursuing pleasure, you are in big trouble because you have to be willing as a leader. We talk about this in The Motive and so many of our books. You have to be willing to suffer for others. That to me is one of the core definitions of leadership. You're taking on responsibility with no real ROI, but just because that's the job of a leader. And to be hedonistic and to be a leader is absolutely counter to one another.
Well, and actually it was exactly The Motive is where my brain went around that word because you're really representing in that book, The Motive, you talk about 5 things that reward-centered leaders abdicate. And so you position the idea that there are 2 types of leadership, reward-centered, which would actually make sense if you're hedonistic. Like, what does it do for me? How does it bring me pleasure, joy, etc.? And responsibility-centered, which is the opposite of saying, hey, in spite of the fact that it's not something I don't enjoy, that doesn't bring pleasure to me, it's serving other people. And this is where it felt like it just so divulged from our core methodology about what makes a great leader, that's the one. The Motive is exactly the place that I went for this.
Yeah, right. And those people are doing it for themselves because to be perceived as cool is largely like, yeah, that would benefit me. But think about, I've had so many managers and leaders that were not particularly cool and I loved them and I'd walk through walls of fire for them and I didn't care if they were cool. And I think this relates to parenting too. Parents should not want to be seen as cool by their kids. And when you do, you usually aren't doing the thing that's in the best interest of your kids, but you're doing something that's going to make you look better, I guess, and feel better about yourself. So, yeah, this is crazy. Now, I think I want everybody to look back and think about famous leaders they know that are bad. And many of them are obsessed with being cool. And whether it's politicians or leaders within companies, and I think about even in like big churches when like pastors are kind of into them, they dress cool and they try to look cool. Oftentimes, that's a precursor to problems that are going to be coming down the line.
Pat, it makes me think of another, you actually have told stories to me about how you came up with the 5 temptations of a CEO. And one of the temptations is this idea that the way that you're perceived, that you want to be liked. And in some ways being liked and being cool, I think that's some of the sentiment around what we're trying to tease out is you're willing to kind of be a chameleon rather than be principled and direct. And so there are stories that you had of people that you had observed in a CEO seat that said it was more important that I was perceived as being cool or being liked than it was that I did the responsibilities of my job.
Yeah, I once worked with a CEO who, and this is how my first book, The 5 Temptations of a CEO, which preceded The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, because the models are very parallel. The very first thing I noticed was I worked with this guy who, even if his company was failing, but he went on TV and described on CNBC or whatever show it was, and he had a good excuse for it and he looked good on camera, he would be really happy. It was like, well, you're not making your numbers. You're not achieving what you're set out to achieve. You're not getting better. Your customers aren't happy, but you're coming across as pretty cool. He was happy. So really, that was the very first thing that got me into this field, is working with somebody that I thought, oh my gosh, he's more interested. We called it status over results.
Mm-hmm.
Status is probably the closest thing to cool that we've ever that we really see, and this gets right back to that. Popularity is the next one, but popularity, I think there's plenty of non-cool people that just are like, I want to be approved of and thought well of. I don't think that's quite as accurate, but that when you combine the desire to be popular and have status, you're in trouble. I mean, you're going to make decisions all about yourself and not about others and not about the company.
Well, in some ways, it sounds like another definition for hedonism. I mean, that's why this was so striking to us, was if that is your reward for being a leader, is that you get to do the things that you want to do, that you pursue pleasure, your own pleasure, then a lot of the responsibilities that you're supposed to do as the leader go by the wayside. And I remember going back to the motive, Pat, one of my favorite portions of that book was maybe a page and a half at the end of that book that said, your sentiment was, I hate the term servant leadership because it implies there's another kind. And I love that so much, because we use this phrase like, oh, there's servant leadership. Well, it implies that there's other kinds of leadership, when in fact, the only reason to be a leader and the only way to be a leader is to serve other people. And hedonism is the antithesis of that.
It really is. And that's why what shocked me most about this whole thing was that nobody actually looked at that. Now, I know they weren't talking about leaders, but who wants to be a friend of somebody who's cool? Why would you want to be a friend with somebody who's into power and hedonism? That is, again, we should run for the hills, not only if they're a friend, but if they're somebody we would work for. I think one of the biggest applications of this should be to like boards of directors and other people who hire leaders. I actually think people like to hire cool people. I mean, I even think they would say that, like, oh, this guy or this gal, we are bringing them on to be the new CEO. And what are they like? Oh, they're very cool. You're going to love them. And it's like, we like the fact that we think they'd be good on camera or they'd be really persuasive. And if that's done out of a desire to be powerful and hedonistic, then that we should probably have a cool warning system. And we should say, so we're going to hire a new CEO. Tell me about her. Well, she's definitely not cool. Okay, good. Tell me more. Because if they're cool, I'm pretty worried. And that sounds crazy. Gosh, when we're kids, we think that that's what it's all about. Very few great leaders grew up being cool. And if they somehow kicked in later in life where they thought, now I get a chance to be cool. I mean, again, and the Silicon Valley is full of these people. And probably one of the highest concentration of dangerous leaders that I saw in various industries in my career.
Well, let me ask you one question as we're exploring this, Pat, just because what if there's leaders? I'd imagine there's a few leaders that are listening to this who are like, I think I'm cool. I hope so. I hope my team thinks I'm cool, but can you, and maybe it's just this specific definition of being cool, but can you strive for both being cool and accepted and being a responsibility-centered leader?
Well, you can't want to. If you're accidentally cool, well, good on you. But if it's only because you're being yourself and you hire the kind of people that think you're cool, which their definition might be, vulnerable and authentic and caring about others, So yeah, different people can have different definitions. But if the world thinks you're cool and you care about that, then definitely you got to do some self-analysis, because that could be a problem.
Well, Pat, 18 minutes into the podcast, and my biggest takeaway and relief is that I don't work for a cool leader. You're very uncool. So I feel relieved by that.
Positively dorky. And congratulations, Cody, for working with a non-cool leader. And let me just say, the people that work for you are very fortunate as well.
Thank you, Pat. Appreciate that.
So don't be cool, and guard against trying to value that. And I think the world will be a better place, because authenticity and selflessness is good. Hedonism and focus on power are not. So I think that's all we have to say today, right, Cody?
That sounds good.
It's enough. All right, thanks for joining us, everybody. We'll talk to you next time on At the Table. God bless.